The following presentation is a production of Ride the Wave Media.
We are those guys. We hope to be four guys bringing you the latest from the National Football League. And Nick Ferguson, from the time that we started this podcast during the NFL offseason, we've been inching, crawling, tippy-toeing towards the NFL regular season. And now we're here. It's week one, baby, right around the corner. Nick Ferguson, what's going on, my man?
It is football time in America, which means as though a lot of the honeydew lists that we had during the spring, they no longer exist because now we got to put everything and everyone on the back burner.
I hope you cleaned out those gutters. You shoveled the driveway. You can never tell in Denver. You're talking spring weather. You might as well be shoveling and, picking up fallen leaves. That's just how things are. But here's a honeydew list for the National Football League in lack of a good transition because they don't pay me enough for those. Nick Ferguson, it's been long enough. We've talked about 10 or so teams that are in contention for the Super Bowl. So we might as well be talking about the team that's just coming off winning the Super Bowl back-to-back, be it the Kansas City Chiefs, but we have the AFC Championship rematch to kick off the 2024 NFL season. So what we're going to do, we're going to preview those Super Bowl defending Chiefs two-time, and we're going to preview those Baltimore Ravens, who they just lost out to Kansas City in the AFC Championship game last February. It was January.
Yeah.
So, Nick, we'll start with the Kansas City Chiefs. But overall, we're talking about a team that, hey, Patrick Mahomes is here. They are pretty much favorites to go to the Super Bowl. Is that name brand value at the most premier position in all of sports? Is that enough alone for you to just write the Chiefs off as the AFC contender, the team to beat, going for that three-peat?
Well, I'm not going to write them off, and I'm not going to pencil them in as a three-peat, right? And I know, with you being a Patriots fan, that I know sometimes that might do something to you and your psyche. But here's what I would say. Being a Kansas City Chiefs fan, you got to be happy and optimistic that you have kind of solidified the quarterback position with Patrick Mahomes and what he's been able to do. Now, there's some issues that Kansas City is going to be presented with that's going to determine whether they can get back to where they once was, because they did that with Mahomes and the Mahomes magic, but they also did it with a great Spagnola defense where they were able to sack the quarterback, get turnovers, and get the ball back to their offense. But things for Kansas City look a little different because, there's no MBS. He's not there anymore. And Kadarius Toney, he's no longer there. Rashid Rice, what's going to happen with his situation and his off-the-field issues? But that's why they drafted Xavier Worthy, who is the speedster out of Texas, and they grabbed Hollywood Brown, who was, by the way, Hollywood Brown is going to be injured. So for me, this may develop into the Travis Kelce, Xavier Worthy show, but then we'll get to it later talking about the Baltimore Ravens. But I don't believe it's as cut and dry because there are so many teams in the AFC that have done some great things building their roster.
That's right. The Denver Broncos, the New England Patriots lead that list off, Nick. I joke. But really, you started with the offense, so let's talk about that side of the ball. You discussed the receiver room, attacking that position in both free agency and the draft, right? There's no one-to-one replacement for Tyreek Hill. So let's moneyball this and try to replace it in the aggregate. Rashid Rice broke out as I don't want to say gadget, but an underneath player, low average depth of target when he wasn't, stretching the field. So the additions of Hollywood Brown, who you said will be out for week one in that matchup against the Ravens with the shoulder injury, avoiding the PUP list, however, and Xavier Worthy, who they used in the first round. Now, how does the dynamic of this offense change when you talk about two players in Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy who are known to stretch the field? And then we'll kind of get into what other pieces kind of insulate and allow Mahomes to be able to do that. So the progression from the offense led by Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce. Fast forward to, they're still the main two target guys, in my opinion, and guys who I am drafting a lot, we'll get to from a fantasy football perspective. But the additions of two, quote unquote speedsters to stretch the field. What does that mean for Patrick Mahomes and his top two target getters from a year ago?
Well, the idea is that it forces Matt Nagy and Andy Reid to be a little more creative in what they do with their offense. I mean, think about it. When they lost Tyreek Hill, everyone said, oh, it's the end of the world, but they found ways to do other things. Now, they were not taking the big plunge shots down the field. It became a lot of misdirection, crossing routes, often misdirections, underhanded throws, overhanded throws. I mean, whatever Patrick Mahomes could dream up, it was readily available. And they're going to have to do the same thing this particular year because you don't really have that big body wide receiver that inside the red zone you can go to. So for them, they're going to go back to that same theory they had a couple of years ago. It's going to be based off explosive plays. But when they get inside the red zone and they get inside those type formations, 3rd and short, 4th and short, that is the Travis Kelce show. So you still have to contend with that. And with the improvisation of Patrick Mahomes, these are skills that you cannot teach. And when you have a quarterback like that, it makes life easier for you if you are a receiver or you're a guy who's catching out the backfield. Now, here's something that they also did. So Samaje Perine was a member of the Denver Broncos. Now he's gone over to join the Kansas City Chiefs, the enemy here in Denver. So the one thing that we know about Samaje Perine, dating back to when he was with the Cincinnati Bengals and Zach Taylor, he was great between the tackles, but more importantly, he was great receiving the ball on the backfield. So you think about what you can add in the mix with Perine's skills and the hard driving, I'm going to run through you mentality of Isaiah Pacheco, play action is there. And I can tell you as a former defender, anytime a quarterback sticks the ball out and you think he's going to hand it off, the defensive eyes draw straight to him like a moth to a flame, open up things down the field. This is how the offense will be more creative and allow them to do things now this season that they were not able to do last season.
Now, two things on that. I think it's fascinating, first of all, the two-time Super Bowl defending champions, again, this week as we're recording the podcast, making key roster additions from teams that would be thrilled to be in postseason conversation, let alone back-to-back defending champions. Samaje Perine coming from the Denver Broncos, Juju Smith-Schuster reunited after getting cut by the Patriots. Peyton Hendershot's going to be their 3rd tight end coming over from Dallas. So it is interesting and a job well done, I will say, because with Clyde Edwards-Helaire going on the non-football injury list, and he's going to miss the first 4 games as a minimum, this is a team that is looking to win their games in December and January and February. So for those of us playing fantasy football, maybe distressed that Samaje Perine is the more pass-catching back compared to Isaiah Pacheco. It's about making sure they have a balanced, distributed offense so that no one guy has to carry the load and be less than 100% when it comes to the postseason, which far and away, much more important if they were to reunite with the Ravens in the AFC playoffs compared to when they get them in week 1. My other point of emphasis, Nick, this going back to the receivers, the numbers coming from Rich Rebar of Sharp Football Analysis on throws of 10 or more yards last year, Patrick Mahomes threw a touchdown at a rate of 1.2%. So just barely 1% of his throws over 10 yards down the field last season resulted in a touchdown. His first 3 years were 11%, 8.5%, and 8%. I'm throwing those numbers out there for one of two reasons. They weren't able to stretch the field. And as a defensive back, Nick, we'll transition to the Spagnola defense shortly here, but the the too high defense employed against the likes of Patrick Mahomes and other elite quarterbacks, how has that shifted more of the downfield vertical offenses compared to maybe a death by 1,000 paper cuts?
Well, the idea is when you play cover 2, you basically keep everything in front of you. So having too high safeties, you tell the quarterback right away, you can't throw the ball outside the numbers. Now, if you want to throw it down the middle, maybe you can with a little success, but we're going to force you into checkdowns. Now, the one thing you can do versus cover 2 is run the ball. And you don't have to run the ball to a point where you're rushing for 130 yards a game. No, Alex, I mean, you could be successful running for 60, 85 yards with Isaiah Pacheco, because what it does, it keeps the defense honest. And if you play cover two, your Mike linebacker, he is responsible for plugging the A or B gap in the run, but also getting down the middle of the field between the hashes on the pass. So if you run successfully and then you run play action, guess what that linebacker has to do? He now has to honor that run, which means that he's going to be late getting back on those dig routes. And this is where those crossing routes have worked, great for Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes. But the biggest thing is Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce being on the same page. They worked in unison together, almost like a couple of guys that you are fond of. When you think about Rob Gronkowski and his bromance with Tom Brady or Julian Edelman, this is when you talk about guys being on the same page and the right hand knowing what the left hand is thinking. As long as they have those two guys in place, Kansas City would always be in the conversation offensively. And what they've learned to do is, listen, the game is about evolution. And before, there was chunk plays down the field. They said, you know what? We don't have to do that anymore. If we can get first downs, right? Every so many plays we're getting first downs is putting us in position where we can score. And oh, by the way, they got Harrison Butker who can kick from 40 yards out. So those are points that they say, you know what? Even if you keep us out of the end zone, which is really hard to do, we still kick field goals from 40 yards out.
Yep. There's really no limit to where the offense can end, and at least have more drives that end with points. On the defensive side of the football, some transactions that are worth going over with this football team. They retained a lot of their guys, right? It was a major decision by this franchise. We spoke about it on this podcast incessantly, deciding to retain Chris Jones, the defensive tackle, over Dara Snead, their shutdown all-pro corner, who they traded to the Tennessee Titans. So, Nick, that pivotal decision, making the choice on the older nose tackle compared to the younger corner, and having more guaranteed money for Chris Jones than what the Titans ultimately had to give to Dara Snead. Your decision on their decision and sort of how that played out with the rest of Spagnolo's defensive roster.
Well, the idea is really simple, that we know pass rush and coverage are married. So they say, look, well, who was very instrumental in helping us get to this point? It wasn't Patrick Mahomes, which is crazy. It was Chris Jones, right? Even at this stage of his career, he was very impactful, commanding those double teams, creating one-on-one matchups for guys like Karlaftis on the outside. So they were willing to let Dara Snead walk to Tennessee and say, you know what, we'll just go get another guy to put out there because we want to make sure we keep our main guy, who's Chris Jones, who can create the most chaos up front. So when you do that and you have a guy like that, you can throw anything in the back end. That's like when Tampa Bay, back in the day, they had Warren Sapp. The Rams had Aaron Donald. When you got dominating guys like that up front, you can do whatever you want to do in the back end, and you can have a mediocre back end. And that's what Spagnola and the Chiefs decided. Well, we want to put the bulk of our investment right there in something that we know that we can guarantee that we're going to get this play in and play out, and it's so consistent. But here's the one thing about Kansas City. I mentioned Chris Jones. You have George Karlaftis. You got Nick Bolden on the second level at the linebacker position. They have playmakers seemingly on every level of their defense, and they're hoping that, yeah, you're losing to Dara Snead, but if you keep those core guys, you can make the same type of noise. And that's what they're thinking. And we'll make subtle tweaks on our defense, scheme-wise, personnel-wise, but as long as we have Patrick Mahomes and we can give him the ball, that's going to guarantee us that we're going to put points on the board. And think about this, Alex. There are 32 teams in the NFL. How many teams are out there that can score 28 points a game?
Right. Not your team, not my team.
Exactly. So if you got Kansas City that can do it and you can get some extra plays from your defense turning it over, you are always in that conversation. So I see why some are pegging the Chiefs to have a three-peat. I'm not, but I can see why that is the conversation.
Well, it also helps that the Kansas City Chiefs know how to draft corners, right? You let Dara Snead go, one, because of the play and effort that they get on the defensive line, But Trent McDuffie and Joshua Williams, who's coming into his third year, Jaden Hicks, who, in the secondary, they've just been able to systematically pluck and find players that fit their style of football, right? The one advantage to having a long established coaching tenure is that you identify players that fit your system, and you find players that by playing in your system, you can get the most out of them. Because I understand you want to highlight what players are good at, but identifying and understanding what you need out of players to be good makes the process so much easier. And, no better pairing than Andy Reid and Steve Spagnola in the NFL at that point. They're developing, George Karlaftis and Mike Dana, who came back on a 3-year deal. They can afford to, this happens to all contending teams. They lose critical and key pieces to Super Bowl championship teams all the time. But being able to replace them, Nick, is what makes them as good as they are. Well,
it's funny that you said that, that it reminds me of a philosophy that worked for almost 20 years, and that was called the Patriot Way. The idea, and it's bloody brilliant, because the idea is that there's certain coaches who overthink the process of coaching and play calling when it's really simplistic. You find out what guys can do and you put them in position to succeed, opposed to saying, well, here's what a guy can't do. Yeah, we know he can't do it, but you want to put him in a position where you exploit the skill set that he does well. And once again, I got to give, Brett Beach and everyone over at Kansas City, their flowers, because they've done a great job of doing it. They and you can say maybe they took a page out of Bill Belichick's book and say, look, let's not overthink it. We got a guy who's extraordinary at the quarterback position. Let's put players around. And these don't have to be the best players in the world, because we're going to function as a team, not as an individual. And that's why Kansas City is the belle of the ball, and everyone's looking to knock them off top of the mountain.
Transitioning to the NFL draft, we spoke at length about Xavier Worthy, who was the 28th pick overall, kind of stacked in there with a number of wide receivers going in that range. Of course, you had the 3 going in the top 10 between Neighbors and Marvin Harrison Jr. and Roma Dunze. And then you had this range where it's the Xavier Worthys, the Keon Coleman, the Xavier Legettes. These guys are constantly going to be compared against one another as they progress. That and Xavier Worthy's teammate, A.D. Mitchell, put up more stats this past season in Texas's offense. But obviously, going to play for Patrick Mahomes is very different than going to play for Anthony Richardson. But no surprise that both of them appear to have an early look at some fast starts with the injuries on their depth charts ahead of them. And then I wanted to focus on their second-round selection, Kingsley Suamataia, the massive tackle out of BYU, who has experience. Yes, he played on the right side 2 years ago, and then transitioned to left tackle. So BYU had him playing both sides after he was a 5-star recruit who originally committed to Oregon. And again, with how much of a precious commodity that this position is, and the number that we saw go in the first 2 rounds of the draft, Suamataia is right there, top of the depth chart. He is going to be out there manning that left tackle spot for the Chiefs on Thursday's opening night. I mean, just for someone who you say is raw, there's no better place for him to land than Kansas City to ultimately be responsible for keeping Patrick Mahomes' blind side protected.
Well, yeah, he's going to be tested on Thursday night for sure. But I mean, as you're a rookie offensive lineman and to play your first game of the regular season at home where you're playing in front of a favorable crowd, so you don't have to really worry about the defensive advantage due to the crowd noise. But here's also the other thing that the baby goat gives you. And it's crazy that I keep making these Patriots references, but it's because it is true. When you think about what Tom Brady was with the New England Patriots, the idea was that, like a Dan Marino for the Miami Dolphins, he was able to get the ball out of his hands on time and the rhythm. So with Patrick Mahomes having that same capability, it makes your life easier as an offensive lineman, because you don't really have to hold your blocks that long. It's 1-1,000, 2-1,000, the ball is gone. Either he's shoving it to Travis Kelce or he's pulled the ball down and he's run it. So for me, it's going to be, I'm not going to say an easy day for the rookie left tackle, but it's not going to be one of those stressful days that a normal left tackle would have when he's playing in his first home game.
And you round things out. I mentioned Jaden Hicks, the safety out of Washington State, playing some critical depth. And then they took some shots. Hunter Norzad, who was the center for Penn State, and CJ Hansen, a guard at Holy Cross. Good run blockers, according to Pro Football Focus. But again, we'll have plenty of time sitting behind established veterans to become better pass defenders. So, Nick, as we are going to transition from Kansas City to the Baltimore Ravens, what is the floor for this Chiefs team? And your ceiling, ultimately, though, I think you're teasing that we're still going to be waiting on the first 3 straight Super Bowl champion.
Well, I'll start with the ceiling first. Obviously, they're always in the conversation. So, worst case scenario for the Kansas City Chiefs, that they end up with that second seed and then have to play on wild card Saturday. But when you look at the floor, obviously it's winning the AFC West. I mean, to look at the AFC West now and to proclaim anyone else in that division toppling the Kansas City Chiefs, man, I'm not a violent person, but I would kind of shake the hell out of you saying that you must be out of your mind, because there's no one right now that I would say that is going to become the supreme team in the AFC West at the particular points. That's kind of the floor for Kansas City, winning the AFC outright. But the ceiling is obviously that second seed, if not the number 1 seed in the AFC conference.
Those are the Kansas City Chiefs. They go head-to-head with the Baltimore Ravens in Week 1, Thursday night, kicking off. And we've got to cover that other side of the field, Nick Ferguson. So the Baltimore Ravens, coming off of a very successful 2023 season, which ultimately netted them not only the MVP for the quarterback, Lamar Jackson, but they were also the number 1 overall seed in the AFC. However, despite having home field advantage, Kansas City showed up and beat them. Dara Snead providing the key defensive play to stop what would have been a Zay Jones touchdown. So we now fast forward to what was a very busy offseason, both for arrivals and departures. Let's start with the negative. They lose some critical pieces that they had on this defense, namely pretty much their entire defensive coaching staff, right? Mike McDonald, who had been traded between the Harbaugh brothers, now the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks, and his top assistant, Anthony Weaver, the next defensive would have been in line to be the defensive coordinator, now signed with the Miami Dolphins to man that same position. So now we circle back to redoing this entire Harbaugh staff on the defensive side, and a team whose identity is known as a play defense type of team, established culture, much like we discussed with the Kansas City Chiefs. And it's going to look a lot different, right? Where you have, why would they sort it this way? Where's my defensive coordinator? Zach Orr is now becoming the defensive coordinator with a number of their assistants moving on elsewhere, either following McDonald to Seattle or Anthony Weaver to Miami. So Mark Leone was hired as the inside linebackers coach, Dennis Johnson on the defensive line, and Doug Mallory over the defensive backs. Nick, as we look, 1,000 miles away from this type of picture, yes, Patrick Queen, Jadeveon Clowney, Geno Stone, Ronald Darby, all of these key losses on the defensive side of the football. Let's start with the coaching staff. I mean, what type of philosophy, knowing that this is something Harbaugh has been preaching and been consistent about through his entire time as a head coach, and they've cycled through defensive guys before, but an entire defensive coaching staff ripped out, how does that affect where this team is compared to the success that they had this time a year ago?
Well, obviously, it's going to look a little different, but here's what Baltimore is preaching. While the uniforms may change, meaning the different people in the uniforms and the people coaching, the one thing that doesn't change is the Baltimore Ravens mentality. They're banking on the mentality staying, static and staying in place, because they're gone all the days of Ray Lewis and Ed Reed. So now you have different people, Roquan Smith manning the middle. So, it's physical, downhill, punishing style of defense. And the way that it's been expressed to me, they don't give a hell who's in the Baltimore uniform. We do what we do when we do it, when we have to do what we have to do. That I know that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
But the idea is the mentality is still the same. Are they going to have some issues as far as personnel based on trying to match up and scheme wise? Yeah, you're going to have those issues, but it's still, at the end of the day, we play physical football. We bloody the noses of our opponents. That's not going to change. So if you're walking in filling the gap for a guy who's now moved on, that is what we anticipated. We don't anticipate anything else but that. At the end of the day, did you punish the runner? Did you punish the quarterback? It's all about, well, you might as well don't even call them the Baltimore Ravens anymore. Just call them Baltimore Punishers. That's kind of the mentality. And I'll tell you this, man, on Thursday night, I don't expect to see anything less. If I were to see anything less than guys running around imposing their will, then I'm going to really say, McDonald not being there, Weaver not being there, there's really been a change in the culture for the Baltimore Ravens.
Right. So the philosophy, the type of defense for John Harbaugh, for Jim Harbaugh is relatively the same. It's just the emphasis and the identification for teams to look at what Mike Macdonald did and the job that he did coaching up, not a Harbaugh system, but something that has been mastered by the Harbaugh brothers, and his teaching ability is what, gave his greater calling to be a head coach. But it's relatively the same system, right? The 4-3 nickel zone that the Ravens have been playing since Rob Ryan was there manning that defense. I'm not too worried about them. I'm also not too worried about them. You mentioned Roquan Smith and Nnamdi Madubuike, who just changed his name from Justin just a couple days ago. Nnamdi Madubuike is going to give you all of the pressure on the interior of the defensive line that allows rushing lanes for so many of these guys that they have thrown darts at in the draft. Dafi Owe, David Ajabo, just so many of these other guys that know how to rush the passer, which can also help them alleviate some of the stress that they have on the defensive backfield. Great players, and Marlon Humphrey and Kyle Hamilton, shout out the Fighting Irish, Marcus Williams as well. And they even bring in Eddie Jackson from the Chicago Bears. They've thrown all-pro caliber players at so many different positions that being coached up and being on the same page is something that, with a team like the Baltimore Ravens, based on the level of success that they've had for decades, you kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, right, Nick? It's like if we see these overhaul changes, coming from somebody less experienced, someone who doesn't have the same track record, you tend to worry, but you sort of write over these types of things, to borrow from Nick Ferguson, the Patriot way. You give them the benefit of the doubt because you've seen it before. So now both of us can compare these teams to the New England Patriots just to make you happy. The key additions on the offensive side of the football, I think, were more noteworthy. The 2-year, $16 million contract handed out to Derrick Henry, coming over from the Tennessee Titans. Look, this offense has always been predicated on Mark Andrews being your top target getter. But what does it mean with Derrick Henry stepping in with the addition of the subtraction of some key pieces on that offensive line, but the Ravens being able to kind of change what they want to do offensively, adding a key piece in Derrick Henry, who to this point has defied, the expectations for a 30-year-old running back.
Well, it changes Baltimore and the fact that they don't have to lean on Lamar Jackson's legs as much. I mean, all you have to do is watch the career of Derrick Henry and, what he was with the Titans. I mean, the guy was a one-man wrecking crew. So you add that to the legs and the skill set of Lamar Jackson. Now you have, as I say, a great tandem backfield. Also, last season, I felt as though, especially in the last game they played against Kansas City, that Lamar wasn't being the Lamar Jackson he was the week prior when he played against the Houston Texans. Mm-hmm. The idea is that that's not the time to put handcuffs on your quarterback and force him to be a pocket passer. I didn't feel as though in that first meeting, or that last meeting rather, against Kansas City, Lamar was putting stress on the defense with his legs. So now you add Derrick Henry to that. Now play action opens up all across the field because Nick Bolton, Spagnola, you can act as though you don't want to plug those A and B gaps if you don't want to. All I know, if you don't do that, your safeties are going to have a long day. And I can tell you, I mean, trying to tackle a guy like Derrick Henry, like the entire game, you're making 16 tackles. Yeah, it's gonna make you question your idea of being a safety. So this is where it helps the evolution of Lamar Jackson and Zay Flowers. Man, God bless his heart. You know, you go back to a couple of games in that Kansas City game, and you're like, oh man, maybe if he just held off trying to push the ball over to get the touchdown, things would have been a little different. So you have to figure that he's going to be a little upset. And then also, Baltimore didn't use their tight ends as well in that last matchup. Isaiah Likely, who's emerged as one of the up-and-coming tight ends. And obviously, you mentioned Mark Andrews. This is an offense that, for me, even though they don't have a lot of burners outside, that there should be a little more fluidity with the offense based on the run game being on track. And that's what Derrick Henry actually gives the Baltimore Ravens.
And it all starts with J.K. Dobbins with the season-ending injury week 1. He's now in San Diego, or I guess L.A. I don't know what just happened there. He's now in L.A. with the other Harbaugh brother. And it sort of goes from there, right? Because they rely on Gus Edwards, who's also in San Diego, L.A., with Jim Harbaugh. And Derrick Henry plugs a real need that they have, knowing that Keaton Mitchell's going to start the year injured. And they've been waiting and getting some modest production out of Justice Hill in that reserve pass catching role. So a huge need that they needed plugged. They also effectively did that in the draft with the 30th overall selection, Nate Wiggins out of Clemson. Coming into last year's college football season, I think Nate Wiggins would have been ranked among one of the top corners as far as their NFL prospects. And then ultimately sliding after a modest, disappointing season, I think, overall for the Clemson Tigers, but a guy who has elite closing speed, was one of the best defenders in the ACC over the last 2 seasons. And it's just about getting up to play strength because he's a long, wiry kind of guy, which is in contrast to what physical corner play that we expect from this Baltimore Ravens team. You called them the bruisers, the punishers. I loved their second-round selection. Again, we talked about this with the Kansas City Chiefs, but Roger Rosengarten out of Washington, I think, is a fascinating one because, again, at the beginning of the season, we didn't expect too much out of that line in general. But what was interesting for me about Rosengarten, I think one of my favorite stats about him, is that when Michael Penix came over from Indiana in the transfer portal, they intentionally moved Rosengarten from the left side to play right tackle, which for Penix, the left-handed quarterback, is the blind side. So they identified that Rosengarten would be the key piece to protect his blind side. Meanwhile, you have Troy Fatanu, who manned that left side, go in the first round to the Pittsburgh Steelers. So again, his draft potential slipped, I think, because of a physical profile or lack thereof compared to his tackle partner at Washington, but a guy that, I trust Ryan Grubb and I trust Kalen DeBoer for where they are now, right? Seattle and Alabama, respectively. But Rosengarten was a guy that they identified as a leader of that offensive line who they asked to move to protect for Michael Penix. And, he gets to sit behind Patrick McCarry for a little bit, may even take over that starting job on either side if we get an injury. And rounding things out with the draft, Adisa Isaac out of Penn State, opposite Chop Robinson, not quite as, buzz around him. But again, I'm going to give the Ravens the benefit of the doubt on that. And then depth, Tez Walker out of North Carolina, the receiver, TJ Tampa out of Iowa State, the corner in the 4th round, Rasheen Ali, who will probably be their 4th running back at a Marshall, Devin Leary in the 6th round, the quarterback from Kentucky, and a couple 7th round picks, Nick Samek of Michigan State and Sanusi Kane of Purdue. So effectively, this is a team that takes advantage of their compensatory picks. They always stack the draft, and if guys leave in free agency, they're always quick to resupply them. Again, I just listed 10 guys that they took in the NFL draft, many of whom will end up on the roster this Thursday. So, Nick, again, we've got the floor, we've got the ceiling, and then we're going to see who you got for Thursday Night Football this week.
Well, obviously, the floor for Baltimore is actually, winning the AFC North. Obviously, there's some competition.
Yes.
In that division, a lot of competition. Because I know someone is saying, well, how could you say that? You look at what Cleveland is capable of doing with the upgrades that they make, and you can't omit Joe Burrow and what's happening out there in Cincinnati. But there's something for me, I look at Baltimore and say, well, there's unfinished business. I mean, Lamar, when he did his massive contract with the Baltimore Ravens, and even when you go back to when he was drafted, his idea is that he wants to bring a Super Bowl to Baltimore, and that will cement his legacy. But he's got to get over these Kansas City Chiefs because they are standing in his way. And I believe that they, Baltimore, that is, they definitely have that opportunity. So winning the AFC North, obviously, that's the floor for them. Now, the ceiling for them is capturing that number 1 seed.
Again.
That is so vital, so important, and it's going to start Thursday when they go on the road to face the Kansas City Chiefs. So that's the way I'm looking at Baltimore, because I still see this as a 2-horse race. It's Baltimore and it's Kansas City. Mm-hmm. And for me, no matter who wins or who loses this game on Thursday night, to me, it's still going to come back to those two teams because the style of football they play, and more importantly, Alex, the two guys who are under center for Baltimore and Kansas City.
Well, again, when you talk about how to break a tie for the playoffs, number one, to separate a playoff, a 1 and a 2 seed or home field advantage versus not. Number one is head-to-head between those two teams. So again, this isn't baseball where games 1, 2, and 3 are going to matter as much as 159 and 62. But you only play 17 games. Week 1 is definitely where things are going to go off. So, Nick, before we split, Thursday Night Football, first game of the season, you got the AFC Championship rematch. We just spent time on both the Kansas City Chiefs and the Baltimore Ravens, their strategies for winning on both sides of the football. So, Nick, before we split, who you got? Chiefs, Ravens.
Well, it's going to be a crazy atmosphere, but I'm going to have to lean heavily towards the Baltimore Ravens. It's the first game of the season, and notice that we're talking about playoff seeding. At the week 1 of the NFL season, we are talking about playoff seeding. This is going to be so important. And if I'm not mistaken, when you look at Baltimore's schedule, they have a lot of their divisional games at the tail end of their schedule as well. So that's why this game on the road is going to be important. And once again, if you want to get to the Super Bowl, as Kansas City proved, a situation they had never been in a while, you have to learn to win games on the road. And this would be a hell of a road win for Baltimore to start off the season.
He's Nick Ferguson, 10-year safety in the National Football League, knows a thing or two about those Kansas City Chiefs, having played against them in the AFC West. I'm Alex Hardy. We are those guys. We hope to be your guys. Enjoy the football season. This is kind of our last episode before the games actually count, Nick. So I'm thrilled that when we started with head coaching changes and, draft preview, here we are. And it's kind of it's a new reality where we have so much live game action to go off to overreact. And I'm thrilled that we get to do this together, Nick, and for you, our audience, to join us right here on a podcast, wherever you get your podcast, so you can see our faces. You can do that on YouTube as well. So, Nick, before we get on out of here, before we watch week 1 of the NFL season, what to say to the people?
Get your popcorn ready. It's going to be another exciting season. And by the way, don't use that artificial crap on your popcorn. Get the real butter. Yeah, use that stuff.